Welcome back to our third week of learning about HLPs. We are so excited to see the collaboration that has taken place already these first couple weeks and look forward to another great week of dialogue and hopefully some networking and more shared ideas that you can take into your own practice as well as share with your own students, our future educators. I would like to again give a big shout out to the Arizona Coalition of Educator Preparation Programs, or ACEPP, and the Cedar Center for providing this opportunity to do this book study with all of you. Excuse me. Please know we are thrilled to be sharing this framework of practice with you all and providing a space for you at the different institutes of higher education, or HIEs, or IHEs, to come together and be able to discuss and share ideas, strategies, and questions on this important work of HLPs. And we may be here in Arizona, but I know with all of you, we are impacting future educators across the nation with HLPs. Forgive me, it's a Sunday morning here. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and go on to our next slide. Excuse me. Because we live in a field with so many acronyms, I just wanted to share again what ACEP stands for and what we are all about. We are a state consortium made up of a variety of IHEs, or again, that higher education or institutions of higher education across our state. I will get that out. And the Arizona Department of Education, along with local educational agencies. Our main goal is to improve educational outcomes for all students with an emphasis on those with exceptionalities. We are supported by the Cedar Center, which is a federal grant program out of the University of Florida that provides technical support to IHEs, local education agencies, or LEAs, and other educational providers throughout the country, whose main focus is to improve the core and specialized instruction and inclusive settings. The funding for this book study is provided by the Cedar Center on ACEP's behalf. And moving to our next slide. So as a reminder on who your facilitators are, I just wanted to show the names and faces again here. And even though a different facilitator is guiding you each week, we are all here to support your learning and any questions you may have along the way. This week, myself, Julie Blair, and Danielle, would you like to say hello?
Hi, yes, it's Danielle Remy-Tauaese.
So we're going to be leading the way and speaking to you in our third section of the book, Social, Emotional, Behavioral HLPs. And just a gentle reminder, this slide just captures the schedule of our readings and areas of focus over the next few weeks and the past couple weeks. As previously mentioned, the book study is divided into 5 modules. It aligns really nicely with the book and the chapters along the way. Our book study learning weeks will run Monday through Sunday. Modules will cycle this way until we conclude the project, which will be on October 2nd. So just please, again, take a minute, review the HLP areas that are going to be covered in each module from that third column. And so this week, as we had shared before, we're going to be focusing on that social, emotional, and behavioral component with HLPs.
Wonderful. So for today's outcomes, we really want to talk about how HLPs overlap in the areas of social, emotional, and behavioral learning. And we'll do that with HLPs 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then from there, we're going to explore the HLP self-assessment tool and understand how to apply that self-assessment tool to our own practice. And then, of course, we are going to explore some additional resources from the Council for Exceptional Children, CEC, ACEPP, CEDAR, and the IRIS Center that all support the SEB HLPs, or Social Emotional Behavioral HLPs. We recommend reviewing each module, pre-recorded presentations on the Monday of each week, and then completing the assignment module readings early in the online learning week. Then all of our participants should plan to respond to one module prompt and at least 2 colleagues or peers on the by the following Sunday of each week. The prompts for Module 3 this week are already posted and will be reviewed later in this presentation. You might also consider adding any resources that you have related to the HLPs and the readings for the week to the resources folder within our HLP book study community. So we're going to go ahead and get started on our section 3, social, emotional, and behavioral HLPs. The high leverage practices in section 3 of our book are all focused on that social, emotional, and behavioral student learning. But before we look more closely at these 4 HLPs, we should establish a common understanding of the differences between the terms social, emotional, and behavioral. And one way that I like to do this, that I feel like is a pretty easy way to remind myself, is to think of social as our interactions with others, emotional is our interactions with ourselves, and behavioral is our interactions with the environment. And while these three are deeply connected and interwoven, being able to distinguish between the needs rooted in the different areas can guide instructors to more effective support of students. It is also important to remember that each one of these HLPs overlap in the other areas. So our collaboration, assessment, and instruction sections all overlap with our social, emotional, and behavioral section. And as we dive more deeply into HLPs 7 through 10, consider how the concepts discussed in our previous 2 weeks can support or be supported by the social, emotional, and behavioral learning. So the 4 HLPs included in section 3 are represented in this word cloud. This image was developed from the overall descriptor of social, emotional, and behavioral aspect, which provides the rationale for this section. If you are unfamiliar with word clouds, the size of the word in the image is related to the frequency that it is used. So with this view, several terms stand out, but I would like to draw attention to 3 specific terms: positive, respectful, and effective. Each of these terms apply to several concepts in HLPs 7 through 10, including positively stated expectations, positive feedback, and positive student outcomes. Positive here serves as a reminder that social, emotional, and behavioral learning is constructive rather than punitive. Similarly, respectful not only refers to the student peer, student educator, and educator family relationships we often associate with SEB learning, but also to our integration of cultural norms and community values in that learning. The original use of effective in the description was an adjective only tied to teachers. In this format, we can see that there is a significant emphasis on being effective, which reinforces that purpose of our high leverage practices to support educators in implementing practices to promote positive student outcomes. So within the context of our discussion today, this means that effective educators have effective learning environments, effective feedback, effective teaching of social skills, and effective evaluation of student behavior, all which will yield a positive student outcome.
Thanks, Danielle. So as we dive into HLP 7, 8, 9, and 10, each of these are going to be centered around and supporting that social, emotional, and behavioral aspect in the classroom, both academically and behaviorally. So when we first look at HLP 7, consistent, organized, respectful learning environment, I want you to think about your classroom expectations, classroom rules, your classroom procedures. When are you teaching your course on classroom management? Are you helping your future teachers think about each of these areas as you're going through them? Are these consistent with the vision and mission of the school and district? When I had been teaching my classroom management with my students, it was interesting because a lot of them don't understand that flow of they all should flow together with the expectations and sometimes our own personal expectations. We also have to make sure they're aligned to the school in which we're teaching or the district. And those rules should be supporting the expectations. And again, those procedures should be supporting the rules and also for the safety. There's some great visuals in your book. If you haven't read yet into HLP 7, 8, 9, and 10, there's a lot of tables I'm going to be referencing. And I'm doing that because there's different grade areas and different content areas in which we're teaching, and they give some great examples on how what this might look like and how to support it. So in the parentheses, you'll see table 1 or table 7.1, 2, 3, and 4 with these areas. And I highly encourage you to please look at these and review them and bring these into your own teaching this semester or in your future semesters as you're teaching these your classroom management course, or this can really even tie in when we get into more of that lesson planning to be thinking about these things as well. Thinking more about your lesson transitions. If you're teaching, with that elementary setting and you're transitioning from your ELA to your math or into your next activities or going to lunch, coming back from lunch, coming back from your specials, turning in assignments, encouraging adherence to expectations, rules, and procedures. Practicing this and consistent modeling. It's not enough just to state it, to go over it day one, and then to post it. Are you showing them what this looks like in your classroom and what your expectation might be? And dependent upon the grade range and the level of your students, this might need to happen more than once. Maybe that first week is all about breaking down those rules and procedures and really helping them understand what those are so that this is supporting all your learners in your classroom. This definitely also will help your students that might be English language learners and helping them understand and breaking that down into smaller steps and actually visualizing what it is that you're saying and speaking to. Again, posting the visuals of the rules and procedures, those are great and highly encouraged, especially for safety, like in your, maybe like I'm thinking even in your secondary levels, on your middle school, when you have maybe the labs with your sciences, or maybe even an art, like if it's in a fine arts, or, I'm thinking back, going in and doing art myself. I remember the art teacher explaining all the things and the tools that you have to use and for safety reasons, what you need to do. Making sure we're doing these things and doing right by our students. Using consistent language. So if you're saying one thing in your rules and your expectations or your procedures, are you consistently saying that? You're not changing words around. Again, being mindful and being consistent so that everyone is on the same page. Acknowledging student appropriate behavior. Are we encouraging and being positive back with our students that we see modeling these things correctly? Um, and then also using that hierarchy of response strategies that discourage problem behavior. Because again, we do want to make sure that we're correcting that, but there are some great strategies on how to do that and support that. And again, I'm going to have you go back and look at that table 7.5 because I do feel like the book, it just gives some great breakdown and just some different areas that you can focus on, whether you're in that elementary, your middle school, or in high school setting. So please be sure to check that out. And again, with some additional resources in 7.6, because um, we know that if we can keep that consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment, that goes a long way and helps to impact even in our instruction and just making sure that our students are feeling safe in their learning environment. So lots of great little tips in HLP 7. So I hope you check out that area for me. And then moving into our HLP 8, this is using that feedback to improve student outcomes. And I want you to think about when we say feedback, this is an area that I've even noticed in my own practice and teaching my own courses because we do so much with the classroom management, we do so much with instructional planning. We get so tied up in all like our silos and what we need to make sure that we are teaching. But feedback is one where I have seen I need to improve upon myself. And feedback, just even personally, is always, I think it's always like our own personal struggle that we have to work on. But especially when we're thinking about our pre-service educators, or if you're in the field as you're an in-service educator, how are you doing this both academically though and behaviorally with your students? That positive feedback, instructive feedback, corrective feedback, and like Danielle had mentioned before, that word effective feedback, excuse me. Are you being specific, contingent, timely, sincere, and culturally relevant? And what all this means is, how are you giving that feedback? When are you giving that feedback? It can go a long way with your students, whether you're giving them feedback on an assignment, whether you're giving them feedback on maybe behavior going on in your classroom. How are you doing that? And it does go in and it's going to tie in here soon. You'll see with even like instructional planning, you'll see but there is an applied within phases of learning, a progression that the book covers. And it was a big aha moment for even, I've been educating for 23 years and it was an aha moment for me even to come back and teach with my next methods course. There's a basic acquisition of skill and ability to do something accurately that we're looking at. So when we're giving our feedback, it's almost like we have to think about how much feedback do we give? And I'm thinking back to my, my instructors here at the higher ed level. When we have these assignments and we're grading them, like let's think about lesson planning, or we're thinking about maybe it's a classroom management, but where are they in their skill set? Like, where have they come from before they took your course? Where do we know they need to go? And how much feedback is good feedback? And are we giving them, feedback that maybe is not quite useful just yet? And so this applied within phases of learning is it that is that point in the book that's really going to break this down for you and make you think about that, because it gives you in to these bullets going back to the basic acquisition of skill, the fluency, that ability to perform the skill at a functional rate, the maintenance, ability to perform the skill across time without reteaching, generalization, ability to perform a skill across settings, teachers, formats, and then adapting or adaptation, that ability to modify the skill, use across contexts or purposes. And I'm thinking, like when we introduce something, when we assess it, and then we're reinforcing it, right? And that's kind of what this is really saying to us. And when we're giving that feedback, when and where, and that is really where it's gonna hit, I think, that that student or even ourselves, like when someone's trying to give us feedback, it's, are we ready for that type of feedback, or do we need to wait, let them get this skill done first and then come back with that additional feedback that'll take them to that next step? So this really goes more in depth with that, and it was just a great piece of reading where I even had like woohoo an aha moment with myself and like how to bring that back into my own teaching. And then the book will also cover strategies to increase rates of specific feedback. And this can come in with coaching, that peer supported self management. When I'm going to talk a little bit more on down the line with this HLP self assessment tool. And I know that we're in a place right now where maybe having a mentor or our candidates in the field having a mentor. Some of them are going right into student teaching. They might not have a whole lot of support, but there's a way that they could actually look at themselves. And even as you're teaching, you can look at yourself on how you're teaching with this self-assessment tool, and it's great. And also check out that figure 8.1. And again, I'll come back to that self-assessment tool because it's a great way to just reflect upon all these areas that you're going to be learning, but really being able to hone in on one at a time, and really try to get that craft, whether it's as you're teaching future educators or it's looking at yourself to teach our future educators. It's just a great tool. So we'll come back to that. And moving on to HLP 9. So teaching social skills. This is where I had another aha, moment when I first started reading about HLPs. This really is where it ties into that lesson planning course that you might be teaching, or the methods course. And I say that because this HLP makes you take a deeper look into the I do, we do, and you do approach with instructional planning. And if you're using that universal design learning or that UDL approach to lesson planning, I know at GCU within our COE, our College of Education, we do use that alignment with our lesson plans. But that lesson plan is really, it still aligns to that I do, we do, you do approach. And this HLP really, it resonates with that because it's making you think of, okay, as I'm going through those steps of, the meaningful expressions, or, again, coming back to the I do, we do, you do, it's making you think of the steps on how you're teaching it, but also bringing in the social skills and the needs of your students. And you might say like, oh, this is a lot. This is a lot to maybe even think in, or to bring in and think about as we're trying to teach the instruction. But I think where we're at is we really do, again, kind of coming back to that, skill check and where they are with feedback. This is like taking that next step with giving them feedback when you see that lesson, but now really breaking it down into, okay, now have you really thought about your students in your class and how you're going to instruct this? So it's really planning for effective instruction. It's beginning with that assessing the social skill problem type and intensity, or identifying students and defining necessary skill instruction, developing an instructional logic to support your students' social skills and engagement. And again, I'm coming back to these tables because I loved them. The table 9.1, it gives a great diagram of that. And if you look off to the side, that instructional logic in this third bullet that I'm talking about, This is what it really is speaking to. It's it's making sure your students, whether you're teaching, again, I'm thinking like of our group right now, you're teaching these our pre-service teachers. And this is where I think, it gets challenging because you're trying to teach them all these different things, classroom management, instructional planning, but this is where the worlds really do have to come together. And this is where we know, even from ourselves, we always go back and we look at like, okay, how did that go? How did that lesson go? Or, in our mind, we think it might go one way and we're trying to think of our students that we have. This is a nice little step to really think about, okay, when I am teaching, am I thinking of these steps in order to make sure that I'm thinking of all my students and how I'm going to scaffold the lesson and the instruction and the planning, and maybe even the activities that I'm going to go into? And you'll see step one is identifying your students and define their targeted skills. What does that mean? Where are your students at in your classroom? And we know our classrooms, they range in skills. And this is that opportunity to really think about as a teacher, and it might be a little harder at first, but as you get to know your students, you're building those relationships, you're getting to understand where they are. This is going to become more second nature as you get into these steps and as you're thinking about your lessons. And what I like about this is intentional. It's making them think not only of this great lesson that they're thinking about, but this is bringing in the student side of things, and it's really helping. If you think about that differentiation, that's where one area my students, they seem to always struggle with, like, how am I differentiating, and how am I making sure that my classroom is inclusive? This is it with using these steps. Step two, breaking skills into teachable steps. How are you instructing? How are you breaking this down so that they will all understand? Are you giving too much at one time? Do you need to break down a step and then have them work on it, then come back and add more? I've seen some beautiful lesson plans with my students, but they're trying to do an awful lot. And let's again think about making that relevance and that age appropriate too. Like if you have younger children and they're doing a lot of steps in one part, they might need to maybe understand, like, this is where we're going to need to break it down. This is how you're going to be able to help differentiate. Or maybe they do this with a smaller group. Maybe this is where they can come in and work with, if they have a para in their classroom or if they have another support staff in their classroom. Maybe this is where you can have those conversations too, where we're bringing that general education teacher and the special education teacher together. Especially in that the secondary level. Is this where you can maybe help bring in that co-teaching part? Where do you need to maybe break down the steps more within groups? But this is just a great model that I loved. It was another aha moment for me to help bring into my own teaching and really help them understand that differentiation part. Um, Again, then just kind of going down through the different steps. Step three, using the relevant examples. That's that cultural relevancy, and also just understanding where your students are and their backgrounds are. Examples, and making sure, how are you facilitating student engagement? How are we doing that? How are you ensuring that you're doing that and bringing that into your lesson? Providing performance feedback. Again, that kind of comes back to that feedback part. Guided practice. We talk a lot about that. Um, and this also will tie back into, you'll see like that HLP, the HLP 7 and 8, if you will, like these next ones, 7, 8, 9, the steps 7, 8, and 9 here. But I love this part. It was a big aha moment for me. And then to really think about how I'm bringing that into that instructional planning or that lesson planning piece and that differentiation. This, I think, can really help them have that moment too of, how am I doing this, and those deeper thoughts, if you will, on how they can approach that area within their lesson designs. Other things to maybe just consider about with teaching your social skills. This is huge. As a recent advocate and going into IEPs, this is one where I've seen some struggle and some even lack of data, or showcasing this evidence in an IEP meeting, is that progress monitoring. What do I mean by that? And again, there's a great figure in the book 9.2 that shows this, but how are you showing your students growth in your classroom? And this is very important, especially if you're working with students with IEPs. They will have certain goals that they should be working on, and you should be familiar with that, especially if they're in your classroom, or if you're a case manager. How are you going to show this to your IEP team when comes time for the IEP, or maybe there's an IEP review, maybe there's some conversations around how they're doing in a class. And this is coming back to that progress monitoring. How are we showing that students are growing? And this is just good for all students. How are you how are you documenting their growth? What can you show from like when they came to you in the beginning of the year to when they're leaving you at the end of the year, or even quarterly? Making sure you're saving those student examples to showcase their growth, whether it's in an IEP team meeting, or whether maybe it's in a teacher parent teacher conference or parent guardian conference. This is just huge. It's big. It's important, especially if you are a part of that IEP team. This is one area that I highly encourage more people to understand and know what they should be documenting and showcasing to help support those conversations. So please make sure you look into that. Student involvement, always building those relationships, understanding your students so that that can come back into when you're thinking of how you're instructing. And again, coming back into that behavior and behavioral support too, with just even your classroom management. Homeschool collaboration, I can't express this enough. This is another area I've seen with my students, especially in that extension part with when they're thinking of their lesson plans. How are you collaborating with, their home? What does that home look like? How can you be supporting and making sure what you're teaching in class, or maybe the behaviors that you're working on in school, everyone is on the same page? I just can't speak enough to really understand that. The first, interaction parents hopefully are having with you are not negative ones, but are positive ones. That goes a long way. And so I just really wanted to encourage that conversation as well.
And Julie, if you don't mind, I'd love to jump in on here as well, because I think with HLP 9, we see a lot of our overlap with our assessment, collaboration, and instructional sections as well. And I think, Jules, you did a great job of speaking to all of those different parts. So I just really wanted to highlight that connection for everyone, where Julie was speaking to our student involvement, our homeschool collaboration. Obviously, we have our collaboration piece right there, and that's what really helps us get those relevant examples. And then also, when we're talking about that generalization, that's where we can really bring in our other educators, by collaborating with them, making sure we're all on the same page with those expectations that we spoke to in HLP 7. And so having those dialogues to make sure that we are all supporting the student in this SEB learning. And then also with our assessment, you see here Julie spoke to progress monitoring, promoting maintenance, um, providing feedback. All of that can also overlap with those HLPs that we discussed in section 2 with the assessment. And looking ahead, this all follows within that effective instruction that we will be addressing next week with section 4. So just to keep that all in mind, that here we have a really great example of how these HLPs work together to promote learning in many different aspects.
Perfect. Thanks, Dee. I appreciate that. And I love how you're bringing it all together, because they all mesh together. We promise. It's good teaching. And wrapping up for this area with our HLPs to support social, emotional, and behavioral, HLP 10, I kind of feel like if you read it, you're like, oh, I just want to skip over this chapter, this section of reading, because anytime I think we see the word functional behavior assessment, I feel like everybody like runs for the hills. But it's titled Conducting Functional Behavioral Assessments to Develop Individualized Behavior Support Plans, excuse me. And when actually Dee and I were talking about this HLP area, we said it's a lot. It's a lot for even a special educator to get their mind around, because it can be scary. When I think you heard the term functional behavior assessment or an FBA, you know, what is it and what does it look like? Well, this chapter does break it down, and it gives some great examples for, I think, more of that special education side. But I don't want my general education teachers to say, oh, I don't need to read this chapter. It's not something I'm going to ever do, because that's not really true. So when we were talking, we talked about kind of breaking this down into just some takeaways that we really hope that you get out of looking at this chapter. For one, for our general education teachers, be aware of what just even a functional behavior assessment is and why this process may take place, because in an inclusive setting, we are really trying to encourage this. Just because you might not perform one doesn't mean that you're not a part of one, because in fact, you actually are, because it comes back to those assessments and feedback and examples that you may be asked to show, or, to help support for a student that we might be conducting an FBA on. So again, this kind of comes back to your assessment feedback and examples, whether that's informal or formal. Again, coming back to that progress monitoring piece that both Dee and I were talking about in the former slide, and just even being able to support your IEP team, because you are a part of this team. And I cannot just express that enough, because I've really seen some, I've seen some great general education teachers. And I have unfortunately seen some that just don't feel like, because they're not writing the IEP, they don't need to be a part of it, and they don't have to bother themselves with progress monitoring or even providing that assessment feedback. And we really want to change that narrative, because it's not true. We need you. We need all of our teachers. We need every person on an IEP team is important, and we're there because of the student. And so I just really think that if you could just, even if you might not ever perform an FBA, but really understanding what they are. So when you even hear that term or that acronym, you know what it is, and you know that if this is happening with the student that you have in class, you know how to support your IEP team. Dee, did you want to add anything to that part?
Yes, thank you. So I also just wanted to emphasize that when we're talking about an FBA, as Julie said, it's kind of a scary term overall, but really the part that our general education teachers and our special education teachers are focusing on is that data collection piece, which is something that we already do. So when you think about the FBA, you're already doing it. You're already looking at these social, emotional, behavioral needs. You're already collecting data on that. The FBA is just that formal collection. And this is where, again, I think, as Julie said, it's really important for our general education teachers to be aware of what this FBA is, because you are such important and valuable stakeholders in the creation of the FBA, especially when we talk about the authenticity of data. And so when we're preparing our teacher candidates to go into the classroom and be effective collaborators, one of those pieces that we really want them to understand is that they get to see a part of the student and the student interacting within that inclusive setting that the special education teacher might not see as authentically. We know that students are very aware of the different teachers. And so if you have someone coming in to observe you, your behavior might change, right? So when we can communicate with our general education teachers that their view of our students in that inclusive setting, in that authentic setting, that they have that unique view that we might not always see, and give them that reassurance that their perspective is very valid and important, then we can build up that collaboration as well. So just making sure that they understand this is something you do in your practice, and you do not have to be a special education teacher to do it, to evaluate that behavior. It is something that we're doing as a team.
Perfect. Thank you, Dee. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
And with our special education teachers, we know, just, and again, I think we can't reiterate this enough. You're not alone with this process. Oftentimes, I know I had conducted a couple in my special education timeframe, but a lot of the work was done with other parts of the IEP team. Definitely a huge part with my psychologist that I was working with. Um, so you are not alone with this process, but again, it's really helping you understand it's a part of that behavioral course that maybe you're teaching, just to reinsure this with your students, or your students are going to be seeing this more, and they will have more support in this area. There's they do speak to the book of the ABC model. This is a common model that you see with the FBA approach, and just making sure that you are you're going through and understanding what this model is. And again, this is for everyone. Just this is just more we're thinking more in terms of the special education teacher side, and just understanding the essential components of the FBA and the data that you're going to need to support this as a special educator and case manager. And again, just using the FBAs to develop your own behavior support plans, or that you might be seeing as part of the IEP, and for the whole IEP team to be aware of. There was another great table that I keep coming back to, the hypothesis statement and behavior support plans, just giving you a breakdown and an example of how and what this might look as you are putting together that ABC model to help then to inform your FBA. And again, Dee, would you like to jump in and share anything? Because I know we've both been special educators, but in different age capacities and different settings. So
Mhm.
I would love to have your input here too.
Absolutely. Well, personally, I think that the ABC model is something that we should really make sure that all of our educators and teacher candidates are aware of. Even before the FBA process, because that ABC model is also a really great self-reflection tool where you can see, okay, when I get to that C column or even in the A column, is there something in my practice that I'm doing that is triggering these behaviors or these emotional responses? Am I giving positive feedback, or am I focusing too much on negative consequences, and is that why I'm seeing a continuation of these behaviors? So one thing that I really appreciated when I worked with the school psychologists and the general education teachers on these FBAs is when we would all sit and go over the data in the ABC models, and really before we jumped into this is how we need to address student behaviors, we would start with this is how we need to address our practice. This is what we should be doing before a behavior occurs, and this is how we should be responding more effectively. So again, just thinking about that ABC model not as strictly something that has to be performed within the FBA, but as a tool that we can use to improve our own instruction.
Perfect. Thank you, Dee, for that. And I appreciate your additional insight. And as we talk about practice and practice and practice, there is this HLP self assessment tool, if I could actually say that. And I wanted to bring this to light because some of you might have already seen this, some of you have might or maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you're not familiar with this. And actually, Dee and I were talking about just doing kind of our own little training on just this tool itself, but we wanted to give you an idea of what this looks like because we just did this with a presentation this last week actually, and a lot of people loved this tool. They saw how they could put it into practice, and when you're learning about all of these HLPs, because there's 22 of them, and as you're learning, they're broken down into the four main areas where we know where we could really learn, like hopefully how we're all learning, if you will, to become better and more intentional in all the areas of assessment, collaboration, instruction, and social, emotional, and behavioral. And as we've talked through, I feel even kind of quickly with HLP 7, 8, 9, and 10 today, there is this tool. And within this tool, it actually covers all of them. We're just giving you a snippet of HLP 7 as an example, and how to apply this as a self-evaluation tool for yourself. But the tool itself is covered. It covers all the 22, but I highly encourage not doing all 22 at one time because as you start diving into one, you'll see why. Because it takes some time to really think about each of these indicators, if you will, under each of them. And all of them have indicators to make you think about how am I doing this maybe now if I'm an in-service teacher, or maybe how do I want to ensure my pre-service teachers really understand what this is going to look like or what they should be doing, as in like their practice, and then maybe going into the field with their field experiences and prepping them for student teaching on what this does look like. So when we look at just HLP 7, establishing a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment, what we would have you do, or what we would do, is you're going to look at each of these indicators just even under HLP 7. And it's the reflective statements, if you will. And you'll see the rating off to the side, and NA maybe it's not applicable yet. Maybe you haven't seen it yet. Maybe you haven't just, maybe if you're teaching, you haven't maybe quite gotten there yet with your students, or maybe even with yourself. Maybe you're not understanding yet exactly what this means. Um, to a 1 to a 5, and a 5 is the one where you feel like you've mastered this, where you've really gotten this down. And when at the end of this, you'll see the tool will link it, but the ratings are given on the tool itself. It really breaks it down a little bit more explicitly on like how where you are really with a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, or a 5 with each of those statements. And as we did this with our audience, we just gave them some self-reflection time, like, how are you feeling first with each of these areas? Well, then we took it a little step farther, and this is where I feel like you could do it as like a teaching tool, really, with like your students, or maybe within the LEAs, whether you're an in-service teacher now, using maybe with your collaborative groups, maybe you're an instructional coach. The administrators we had out there, we could use these as like a baseline, maybe as they're having conversations with their teachers, and not just their novice teachers, but their teachers across the board. This is where I think you can really build or bridge the gap from your veteran teachers to your novice teachers, or maybe your veteran teachers, they think they might be doing this, but they could even be doing this maybe even better. So it's just a great tool to really have a baseline of where are you, how comfortable do you feel with this, and are you really understanding what it was? And coming back to what Dee said in the beginning, it was a great question that came up because they said, well, how do I know what is social, emotional, and behavioral when I'm applying these, 1 through 8? Because what we had them do was, after we looked at this, we had our audience just even hone in on just two, and we chose indicator 3 and indicator 5. But for the purpose right now, oh, you can go back to, yep, we can leave it
Sure.
right here. For the
Mhm.
purpose for this one, we had them really just look at indicator 3, how I explicitly teach, reteach, and model 3 to 5 positively stated expectations. Examples given like be respectful, be responsible, be safe. So we had them think about, what does this look like in your classroom or maybe in your school, like as an administrator? And what questions would you maybe have about this area? Because maybe you don't know. And so this again is another like teaching tool, like another addition to if you're teaching this with our pre-service teachers, or maybe you're in service and this is something that maybe you want to bring back for just yourself or maybe even your team. And how do you think about that? So again, we had them self-reflect, and we had them like write down on like some sticky notes that were kind of color coordinated, and then we shared. And you could do this. What's great is you could kind of do this like as you see us with the Jamboard, like virtually. You could do this in person, like with some butcher paper, and have them collaborate with that as well. Like if you're thinking of like an activity in class, but to even have them really understand, like, okay, are they getting what does it mean when we say social, emotional, and behavioral? And I'd love for Danielle, because Danielle was one like, hey, what if we approached it this way? So Danielle, I'm going to have you take it from there and like some things that they shared out.
Of course. Thank you, Julie. And I apologize for the jumping around with the screen. My mouse is being very touchy right now. Um, so, as Julie shared, that feedback that we got from several educators on, how do we really differentiate between these three? That's when I kind of molded over and I thought, well, my own approach is to think of social as our interactions with others. And so when we look at that and we look at some of the sticky notes that we have here from these very different educators with very different backgrounds, I love the ideas that they came up with to have collaborative group procedures where that's where they're really getting that student feedback. So absolutely ties in with everything that we've been talking about today. Some role play, which I thought was an excellent example. That's something that I've used in the past too, to have that the students who, they're really struggling with these social skills. How am I supposed to teach them the appropriate ways to do it? Well, a lot of times what we can do is we can have them um, take on the role of someone who is doing it appropriately, and we can be the ones who jump in and we demonstrate that undesired social skill so that they get that feeling, they develop that empathy and understanding of, oh yeah, I don't really like I don't really like that. I don't like when someone's in my space or when someone does XYZ. And so they can start to understand then how to improve their interactions with others. I also love this idea of the community circle because, again, that's really fostering our empathy. That's where we can tie in some more of that cultural relevance. So I think those all were really wonderful examples of our social learning. And then for our emotional learning, that's our interactions with self. So again, some wonderful, wonderful examples here. Someone had brought up the zones of regulation practice or social development theory, which is a wonderful way for our students to have talking points about their feelings. Sharing the good news every day. I think too often we are, especially with our higher ed students, we are sort of jumping into teaching right away. You know, we want to get going. We have so much to cover and a lot going on. And so just remembering to take that moment to share some positives will put us in a space, a healthy space where we're able to do more learning because we are feeling positive. We have, a good rapport with ourselves and in the community. And then talking through those emotions too. I think that's something I know from my experience in the classroom. It's not necessarily something that we all know how to do naturally, right? Talk through our emotions as adults. For some of us, that's very challenging. So we have to remember that for our students, especially our students with exceptionalities, this is even more challenging. And so we need to model to the adults, to our teacher candidates, how to facilitate these discussions where we're able to talk through our emotions so that they can help their students then learn that skill. And then with our behavioral or interactions with the environment, that's really coming back to those expectations, rules, and procedures that we talked about early on. So using visual reminders, going through problem solving steps with students, if they're showing a challenging behavior and we see XYZ happen, let's go back to X. Let's start over. Let's rethink how we can more appropriately engage with our environment and use our tools for self-regulation, things like that. So again, all of these examples that we have up here are coming from various educators, various grade levels and positions. And I think that really gives us a nice indicator of the many ways that we can support social emotional behavioral learning within a K-12 environment, which then we can use in our IHEs to figure out, okay, now how do we prepare our student candidates, or excuse me, our teacher candidates to implement these practices? What can we do? Where can we embed them? How can we integrate these into all of our courses, not just our classroom management, not just our methods courses? How can we integrate this throughout our programs?
I love it. Thank you, Dee. And again, I just wanted to come back to this is coming from that tool. And this is why I love the tool, but the tool wasn't designed necessarily to go through every single HLP, all 22 of them. But we're hoping that this tool could be used as if you're teaching one of these areas within your classes, or if you are currently teaching now, or even as an administrator in the field, we're trying to have them adapt to how they could use the tool to help strengthen maybe their school and their culture at their school, with getting the teachers more consistent. Whether you are in the classroom now, having you reflect in how are you doing this and maybe having conversations with your teams. And as a pre-service teacher, we're just hoping to give you some more tools to help you think through and as you're teaching these areas. So especially, I think SEB just it goes through all of the areas, and that's why again these just they're so interchangeable when you're teaching in these different courses possibly, but they all come back and they tie together. And these HLPs could really help you demonstrate to your candidate, like to your future teacher uh, your future teachers will say, and what this maybe looks like. And it could really help you help them break this down maybe more in their mind as maybe like it's again like another component with when you're breaking this down and you're teaching, and how you could possibly do this with them, like what we just shared with you as we did in a presentation. And we received a lot of great feedback, just to even make this, to take it back and make it even better to how we can help um, demonstrate what this HLP 7, just one indicator of HLP 7 looks like. So again, there were a few other indicators. This is just one, but you could see just the rich conversation that you have just around one to really help them understand just one HLP area. So even if you wanted to focus on one HLP, like whether that was 7, 8, 9, 10, and how you could really break it down to have your, I'm going to go with like your pre-service teachers, have them understand it, because I think they get so much content. Sometimes we're not helping them think through more of what and the how. And I think these HLPs really help to do that. Danielle, would you like to add anything?
I think you covered it perfectly, Julie. I think, if you haven't been able to tell already from this presentation, Jules and I feel very passionate about social emotional behavioral learning. So if there are any other ways that we can really connect with you all and hear some more ideas from you all outside of the discussion, I think we would both really love to talk more about it. But I'm hoping that these talking points that we have so far will really start a rich dialogue in our reflection this week. So we can actually go ahead and look at our reflection questions. So this slide displays the Module 3 reflection questions. You can see we have 5 of them here. When you are ready, you can go ahead and answer at least one of those by no later than Sunday, the 18th. So please respond to any or all of the prompts in the discussion board, and this can be accessed by navigating to the EdWeb um, uh, website that we have.
Perfect. And these questions again they'll be posted again in the forum for the discussions too. These are just to help you think through as you're looking and listening to us today. So thank you. And so I think going into our next steps, I think again, Danielle, you had shared these as well, just making sure you're going through and reading the introduction section on the social emotional behavioral. These are your pages 103 and 1 through 155. I don't know about you all, but especially because I know our focus is more on these, but this book, I love this book. It was funny because in our presentation this last week, an administrator was saying this is like her Bible, like her new Bible. She loved it. It really helped her to even understand and to break these down to her own staff. Whether it looks like it's quite a bit of pages, I feel that the reading has just been easy because I just feel like as I'm reading, I'm absorbing, I'm getting these aha moments, and I think we're hopeful that you are too. And just make sure, as Dee shared, to respond by this upcoming Sunday, 9/18. Can you believe it? We're already in the middle of September. Making sure you're commenting on 2 other participants, if you will, within the Module 3 discussion by next Sunday as well. Think about how and where you model the importance of social, emotional, and behavioral learning. And we're hoping with our presentation, it's just helping you maybe think a little bit more than maybe where you were before, or if this is your area, if you have some more ideas and strategies to share, or just ideas as well, like Danielle had shared, we would love to hear those too. So this module is going to be available on Monday, or module 4, excuse me, will be available by Monday, 9/19. I should clarify that. So then again, just don't forget to come back and look for your pre-recorded presentation to help you get going on those reading assignments.
Thank you, Julie. So on behalf of Julie and myself and the book study facilitator team, thank you so much for participating, for listening to us today, and for seeking to improve the practice of educators. Your immediate point of contact is going to be the book study representative for your institution. However, feel free to reach out to any one of us if needed.
So thank you. Thanks again, Danielle. Thank you guys for listening. And we will let you be free. And we hope that you have an
Mm.
amazing week. And we're looking forward to your discussions. And thank you, Danielle, for being with me and discuss this discussion today, because I know, like you said, this is near and dear to our hearts. So thank you all for listening.
Absolutely.